Here is the full story, written in simple, natural language, with no headings, just one flowing narrative. The pack house stood on the edge of the forest, like something built by people who had forgotten how to be afraid of anything. Stone walls, high windows, and a smell that never really went away. Old wood, wolf fur, and something underneath that Ren Solis could only describe as grief, that had been sitting in one place for too long. She stood at the front gate, with a single suitcase and a letter in her pocket that told her where to go and who to report to. It didn't tell her much else. It didn't tell her that the Alpha King barely spoke to anyone since his mate died. It didn't tell her that his son hadn't said a real word in almost a year. It didn't tell her that the whole pack was watching every new face like it might be the one that finally broke something that was already cracked. Ren didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she needed the job, and the job needed someone who wasn't afraid of silence. She was good at silence. She'd had a lot of practice with it. The man who met her at the door was tall in the way that made door frames look smaller. Cade Ashrin didn't offer his hand. He looked at her for exactly as long as it took to decide she wasn't a threat, and then he looked away. "The boy's room is upstairs," he said. "He doesn't talk much. Don't push him." "I won't," Ren said. "He bites sometimes." Cade said it like a warning label, flat and practiced, like he'd said it to every caretaker before her, and every one of them had quit within the month. "Not hard, but he does it. Okay, that's all you need to know." He walked away before she could ask anything else, and Ren stood there in the entrance hall, listening to the sound of his boots fade down some hallway she hadn't been shown yet, and thought, well, that went about as warm as a winter well. She found Milo in his room, sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by wooden blocks he wasn't using. He looked up at her with eyes that were too old for a 4-year-old, the kind of eyes that had learned to watch adults before trusting them. "Hi," Ren said. "I'm Ren." He didn't say anything. He picked up a block, turned it over in his hands, and put it down in the exact same spot. She didn't try to fill the silence. She just sat down on the floor across from him, picked up a block of her own, and started building something wobbly and pointless, and let him decide, in his own time, whether that was interesting enough to notice. It took him 4 days to sit next to her instead of across from her. It took him a week to fall asleep with his head against her arm during story time. Nobody else in that house had gotten that far, not even his own father, not in the last year, not since the day the pack lost its Luna and Milo lost his mother in the same terrible hour. The pack didn't know what to make of Ren. She wasn't pack. She wasn't a bride candidate. She was just an Omega who'd been hired to take care of a child, and Omegas weren't supposed to matter much in a place like this. Not officially, not on paper, but paper never stopped people from watching. The council watched her at meals. The kitchen staff watched her in the halls. And Cade watched her the way a man watches weather he doesn't trust yet, waiting to see if it turns into something worse. 3 weeks in, there was a formal dinner, the kind where every fork had a job, and every silence had a rank. The council sat at one end of the long table, old wolves in old suits, discussing pack business in low voices that stopped whenever Ren walked past with Milo's plate. She wasn't meant to be at that table. She sat near the end, close enough to help Milo with his food, far enough to not really count as a guest. Milo was bored out of his tiny mind. He'd been good for exactly as long as a 4-year-old can be good, which is to say, not very long, and then he slid off his chair and disappeared under the table the way children do, the way that makes every adult in the room pretend not to notice, because pretending is easier than chasing. Ren felt him before she saw him, small hands finding the hem of her sleeve, and then teeth. Not hard, a puppy testing something out, a claim more than a bite. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet right before somebody gets thrown out of it. Because in a pack like this, an old law still meant something, even if nobody said its name at dinner parties. A cub's bite wasn't a tantrum, it was a bond mark, whether the cub understood that or not, whether the person on the other end of the bite understood it either. Ren felt every eye in the room land on her at once. She didn't apologize. She didn't yank her sleeve back like it was something that needed fixing. She looked down at Milo, still holding on, still watching her with those two old eyes, and she pulled him up into her lap instead. "You could have just asked for a hug," she said quietly, only to him. Milo didn't answer, but his grip loosened. He leaned his head against her chest, right there in front of the entire council, right there in front of his father, and closed his eyes like the room full of judgment simply wasn't his problem. The council's eyes did the math out loud without saying a single word. Ren could practically hear the calculations. Outsider, caretaker, Omega, and now this. Cade didn't say anything either. His jaw was tight enough that Ren could see the muscle working under his skin, but his eyes weren't on the council. They were on his son, on the way Milo had reached for someone the way he hadn't reached for anyone. Not the healers, not the nursemaids, not even Cade himself, since his mother died. Dinner continued. Someone changed the subject, badly. The council elders exchanged glances that Ren pretended not to catch. And Milo slept through dessert with his fist still curled in her sleeve like he intended to keep it there. Later that night, after Milo was finally down for real, tucked into his bed with the hallway light left on the way he liked it, Ren found Cade standing outside the boy's door. He wasn't going in. He was just standing there, the way people stand outside rooms holding things they don't know how to carry. "You should have corrected him," Cade said. Not angry, just tired in a way that went deeper than one dinner. "In front of the council, you should have made him let go, made a show of it. Given them a reason not to worry." "Would that have been true?" Ren asked. Cade didn't answer right away. "He wasn't being difficult," Ren went on. "He was asking for something the only way he knew how. If I'd pulled away, he would have learned that reaching for people gets punished. I've had enough of that lesson myself. I wasn't going to teach it to him too." Something moved behind Cade's eyes, quick, like a door opening and shutting, before anyone could see what was on the other side of it. "You don't know what that bite means. Not really, not the old law behind it." "I know enough," Ren said. "I know he hasn't looked that peaceful in longer than 3 weeks tells me. That's enough for tonight." Cade looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that wasn't about judgment anymore, wasn't about the council or old laws or what the pack would say. It was just a father, looking at someone who had done, without trying, what he hadn't managed to do himself, in a year of trying very hard. "Thank you," he said. It cost him something to say it. Ren could tell by the way his voice caught halfway through, like the words were heavier than they should have been for 2 syllables. "You don't have to thank me for sitting on the floor and building bad towers out of blocks," Ren said, and something in her tone made it almost a joke, almost light enough to breathe around. "I do," Cade said, "because nobody else stayed long enough to find out he liked towers. He left it there." He didn't explain what he meant by that, and Ren didn't ask him to. Some things were better left sitting in the space between two people, unexplained, understood anyway. The days that followed were quieter, but not in the old way, not the heavy, grief-soaked quiet the house had carried before. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a held breath finally lets go. Milo started talking again, small words at first. Up, more, Ren, and then whole sentences that came tumbling out of him, like they'd been backed up behind a dam for a year, and somebody had finally pulled the right stone loose. He followed Ren from room to room like a small, determined shadow. He held onto her sleeve, sometimes just the fabric, sometimes her whole hand, and nobody in the house said anything about the old law anymore. Not out loud, though everyone still knew it was there, sitting under the surface of things. Cade started coming to story time. He'd stand in the doorway at first, arms crossed, pretending he was just passing by. Then he started sitting on the edge of Milo's bed. Then, one evening, he sat all the way down on the floor next to Ren, his shoulder nearly touching hers, and listened to her read the same book about a bear who couldn't sleep for the 3rd night in a row without complaint. "You're better at this than I am," he said, after Milo had finally drifted off. "I've had more practice pretending stuffed animals have complicated emotional lives," Ren said. "It's a very specific skill." Cade almost smiled. Almost. It was the closest thing to one Ren had seen on him since she'd arrived. "He hasn't slept through the night without waking up crying in almost a year," Cade said, quiet, like it was a confession. Since she died. Since Ilara. He said the name like it still had teeth of its own, like it could still bite if he wasn't careful with it. He used to wake up looking for her. Now he just falls asleep. He's not looking for her, Ren said gently. He's found somebody who stays. Cade looked at her, and for a moment, the careful distance he kept around everything, the council, the pack, his own grief, seemed to slip, just slightly, just enough to let something else through. Is that what you're doing? He asked. Staying? I signed a contract, Ren said, lighter than she felt. I don't really believe in leaving halfway through the fine print. That's not what I asked. Ren looked down at her hands, at the small tear in her sleeve, where a cub's teeth had marked it weeks ago, a tear she hadn't bothered to mend. I don't have anywhere else I'd rather be, she said finally. Is that a good enough answer? Cade nodded slowly, like it was. Not everyone in the pack was as settled about it as Cade was learning to be. The council hadn't forgotten the dinner. Word had moved through the house the way word always does in a place with too many old wolves and too little to occupy them. Quietly at first, and then not quietly at all. An elder named Torvin, the oldest of the council, and the one who liked the old laws best precisely because they gave him power over things he otherwise couldn't touch, called for a meeting. He wanted the matter addressed. He wanted it made clear, publicly, that a caretaker's position did not entitle her to claims the pack hadn't sanctioned. She is an Omega hired to mind a child, Torvin said, in front of the full council, in front of Cade, who sat at the head of the table with an expression carved out of stone. The old law says what it says. A cub's bite marks a bond. If the Alpha King intends to ignore that, he should say so plainly, instead of letting the pack whisper about it in the kitchens. Then I'll say it plainly, Cade said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I don't answer to whispers in kitchens, and I don't intend to start now. That isn't an answer, Alpha. It's the only one you're getting today. Torvin's mouth thinned into something unhappy, but he didn't push further, not with Cade's eyes doing the kind of quiet, immovable thing that reminded the whole room exactly why he was the one sitting at the head of the table. Later, walking the long hall back toward Milo's room, Cade found Ren waiting near the stairs, not eavesdropping exactly, though she'd heard enough through the door to understand the shape of what had happened. You didn't have to defend me in there, she said. I wasn't defending you, Cade said. I was refusing to let old men decide what my family looks like. The word sat between them for a second too long before either of them moved past it. Family. He hadn't planned to say it. Ren could tell by the way his eyes flickered, just slightly, like he was surprised to hear it out of his own mouth. That's a big word, Ren said carefully. I'm aware, Cade said. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. But something had shifted, the way weather shifts before anyone can point to the exact moment it changed. You only notice once you're already standing in the rain. Milo's 5th birthday came at the start of the following month, and the pack, despite all its old laws and older grudges, still knew how to throw a good celebration when it wanted to. There were lanterns strung between the trees at the edge of the grounds, and food enough for 3 packs, and Milo ran around in circles with the other pack children like he'd never spent a single night crying for a mother who couldn't come back. Ren watched him from the porch steps, a cup of something warm between her hands, and felt, for the first time since she'd arrived at that house, something like peace. Not happiness exactly, something steadier than that, something that felt like she'd finally stopped waiting for the ground to move under her. Cade came and sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, the way it had become normal for them to sit lately, without either one commenting on it. He asked me today if you were going to stay forever, Cade said. What did you tell him? I told him I hoped so. Cade turned his cup slowly in his hands, not looking at her. The way people talk about the hardest things while looking at something else entirely. I should have asked you the same thing myself a long time ago, instead of making a 5-year-old do it for me. Ren felt her chest go tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear. You could ask me now, she said. Cade looked at her then, fully, the careful distance gone from his face entirely. Ren, will you stay? Not as his caretaker, Not because of some old law about a cub's bite. Because I want you here. Because he wants you here. Because this house has felt like a place people could live in again since you walked through that door, and I don't want to find out what it feels like without you in it. The lantern swung gently in the wind above them. Somewhere on the lawn, Milo laughed at something one of the other children said, bright and unguarded, the sound of a boy who had learned, finally, that reaching out for people didn't have to end in loss. Ren set her cup down. Yes, she said, I'll stay. Cade didn't kiss her that night, not with half the pack still on the lawn, and lanterns swinging, and a council somewhere inside the house still trying to work out what old laws meant for a family that had stopped waiting for their permission. He just reached over and took her hand, the same hand a small cub had once claimed with nothing more than a bite and a stubborn kind of hope, and held it like he intended to keep holding it for a very long time. The council never did get their formal answer about the old law. They didn't need one, in the end. The whole pack could see it plainly enough. Every single day, in the way a small boy ran to Ren first when he skinned his knee, in the way Cade's house had learned to laugh again, in the way two people who'd both learned the hard way not to expect much from the world had quietly decided to build something steady out of it anyway. Nobody in that dining room the night it all started had believed Ren understood the old law when she let a cub's teeth close around her sleeve and pulled him closer instead of pushing him away. They were right. She hadn't understood the law at all. She'd just never been the kind of person who could pry a child's hands off the first safe thing he'd found in a very long time. And it turned out, in the end, that was its own kind of law, the only one that had ever really mattered in that house.